this work, which is, some people are actually sitting inside, which is quite cool.
It's okay, I sit here, is it?
Yeah, you lean against it, you can climb on it, smash the glass a bit more, whatever takes your fancy. Yeah, this piece is called Balls to the Walls, and try this thing here. Really giving a background and a bit of context to this work and kind of where my work is coming from as an artist. I did train as an architect for quite a few years and then kind of switched over maybe about 2006 to more visual arts, so kind of stemming on from the city and work that's focused on architectural elements and elements from the city, but presenting it in perhaps a more antagonistic and unaccountable fashion. Basically, when I was coming to think about this piece, wanted to try and lift off the wall, denote space in wireframe, provide visibility and permeability and ability through. There's a term that I've been trying to coin recently and working towards called the handyman aesthetic, and this diagram really operates. I feel the handyman as the artist or as the guy putting things together is operating between two types of city space. On the left you have capitalist space, sterile space, which links in with this show, and then on the right dissonant space. I'm just going to give two examples of that. Again, a bit like what Mark was talking about with these kind of tall, very modernist skyscrapers. This is Canary Wharf, and for me, the kind of ultimate bastion of capitalist sterile space in the UK. Very much impenetrable, cold, and very shiny, never really allowing the viewer or the user, the city inhabitant, to get behind the facade. And then on the other side of the diagram, you've got fragmented dissonant space, and this is really kind of broken, confused type of space. Dionysian in the fact that it's sort of unaccountable, abandoned, excess, and often subversive. You know, if you wanted to pump yourself with a crystal meth, this would be the ideal place to go. So the handyman, I feel, is working and operating in between these two types of spaces in the city. I just drew up this diagram really about this work and kind of some of the concepts which I'm not going to take too long to kind of go into, but really the things that are informing it. I'll go ahead and get into that. Firstly, the process of extraction of particular structural elements out of the fabric of the city. I'm very interested in taking charged elements and providing them in a gallery. And the gallery gives you a good opportunity to create the sense of other. So you're kind of folding space on itself. You have the space that we're in at the minute, the boundaries of this enclosure and volume, but then you're also providing the sense of meaning and other. So with this work, you do have a position where you're inside a space within a space. A big part of the work was allowing the viewer the affordance to examine both the front and the back of the work, allowing you to get round and have a look at the fragility of the back in comparison to the very brutalist and hard surface of the front. In these kind of sterile spaces, it's very difficult to understand how the structure is operating, and in some ways you're prevented from really getting in behind the building. What you're presented with is quite often a very privatized and sterile experience of the city. The facade is skin, cloak, unmasking and demystifying the grandeur of the hard surface to expose the fragility in the space, both the front and the back. And again, the use of material, which I'll talk about in a little bit, presenting something that's very hard and a parody, if you like, of what you see in facades around you, particularly this new Titanic building you mentioned with its panels, presenting the back of that, but somehow warping it with a change of material, a low-tech kind of degrading material. And then, of course, everything does start to look like everything else, and we're trying to find the source of this copy-paste world. And so it's not just about Belfast, of course, but this kind of super modernism has crept into all of our cities, and you can stand in the middle of Victoria Square and quite happily think you were in Vancouver or in the east somewhere in Dubai. All of the materials are shipped in and very, very standardized. So this standardization, well, firstly sort of the extraction, I just wanted to mention Gordon Clark, who's a big influence for me. I feel he's the ultimate anti-architect in his work beside the Pompidou Centre here on the right. Before the Pompidou Centre was fully built, he went in, this is called conical intersect, and he went in and just sawed out these huge pieces of structural urban fabric and presented them very literally in the gallery. And while that's very interesting, taking literally the extraction that you've taken from the city and putting that in the gallery, in my work I feel more inclined to replicate and mimic that fabric, so to reconstruct the fabric and where the learning process is within that, and what you can learn about a particular site or a particular system or way of constructing. So getting back to that standardization and this idea of the modular, Corbusier, one of the most influential architects in terms of modernism anyway, really hit the world with standardization of sizes and ergonomics. You've probably heard of the machine for living in, and Corbusier's 5 points of how to build, and some of his disciples like Oscar Niemeyer would say things like, once the structure is finished, once the primary structure is up, that's the building finished, and so you've got the sense of the module in these high-rise buildings in skyscrapers, and these are forming a very potent part of sterile space. I'm just going to read a little bit from Corbusier's Le Modular, which is a book where he also had Modular 2. These are the covers of his books, and they kind of correlate to the golden section, which again gets back to the Vitruvian man. So there's this hinting back from modernism to antiquity, and the division of the body and certain very simple equations and algorithms that lead to the module, and that's why we have standard sheets of plywood and these very, very standard sheets of glass in our buildings. Sterile space is order and purification as described by Corbusier in Le Modular. The lines do no more than establish order and clarity on the level of geometrical equilibrium. Achieving or claiming to achieve a veritable purification, measures enter into everything. Corbusier took Leonardo's suggestion of the golden ratio in human proportions to an extreme. He sectioned his model human body's height at the navel within 2 sections in the golden ratio, and then subdivided these sections in the golden ratio at the knees and at the throat, to little actions here, and he used these golden ratio proportions in the modular system. So while this has actually been kind of the source of the module, which has then become a reflection and a hyper-real mimicking across cities around the world, in my work I'm interested in working with this idea of the module, and as you can see in this piece, what looks like the golden section could exist within these rectangles, but kind of screwing with it a little bit, messing with it, reducing some of the proportions, expanding some of the options within it. Another part of this work, probably maybe the most important part, is this idea of being there just after an event has happened. So in the far panel there you can see a smashed piece of laminated glass and what looks like the object that was thrown to break it. And I'm interested in this idea of the wall, of a divide, boundary and a barrier, and what function, what's the job of a wall. This of course is a section of the peace wall, one of the peace walls in Belfast, and it looks like something's been thrown against it and ignited, and there is that feeling with even this image that again this module exists, and the change of material as you go from ground level to first floor level, to above that. The amount of visibility is altered, and permeability. I wanted to reverse that really with this piece. The idea of a riot, violence, protest, activism. Again, this is quite potent at the minute with what's happening around the world, and the parody of that really interested me in this work. Flag kicking the wall. And then you get this more, it's not anarchic, but kind of isolated cases of random violence, which again kind of correlates to the artistic intervention. I think bus shelters are notoriously broken around Belfast, and that need to break and destroy is something, again, Matt Clark mentioned in his work. One of his quotes is designing for absence, designing for collapse, designing for void. This idea that you need to build and then destroy. Part of this work, again, you'll see these triangles that make up the panels on the top, and then I've hinted at it in the tarp with certain folds that, again, exist within that standard module. And then at the end, a more organic, natural fractalization of the glass. I'm interested in fractals, both in an architectural argument, because I think architects quite often mix their language up, and there's a big debate at the minute, but kind of opposite sides of the use of random play in architecture. Frank Gehry, architects like that, and the deconstructivists who build these huge big buildings and use these very complex computer programs, are attaching this language of nature to their building process, but actually the two are quite far removed. It's an interesting argument, but also just in terms of the further you zoom in, the more detail is exposed, and that's part of the work at the far side and the bottom in terms of artificially allowing that to happen. Again, geodesic structures, Buckminster Fuller, domes, and how man has taken these forms into the city really interests me. And then artists who are around at the minute, like Oscar Tuazon, who's a friend of mine who's doing very well with his extraction of these survivalist cultures who build very, very odd architecture out in the woods. And he's bringing that work, or that very natural phenomenon, and building upon that as an artist. But what interests me is not so much if you can hide in the woods, but if you can hide in the city. And so I'm kind of interested in the language of the renegade, kind of handyman within the city, but using this fractal and geodesic kind of language. A term that's interesting to me at the minute is allotropy, and it's the different structural modifications of the same element. So if you imagine carbon can be coal, diamond, and graphite are very different structural forms of the same element. And just lastly, on the material again, I'm very interested in bringing this subordinate, or some would even say waste material from the city, the stuff that kind of props up the construction of the city, but using that as the primary material for the artwork. In terms of the waste material and excess, George Bataille comments on that and says that in the old forms of bartering, people weren't actually bartering in markets to acquire. There was a need to lose. I think the handyman artist is somewhere in between that need to acquire and need to lose. And so the material becomes a currency, if you like, for form. Of course, this is quite rough, this aesthetic, and there's very deliberate choices in particular materials. Some are reused, some are fresh, and you can see that quite obviously. But the aesthetic, in terms of its roughness, is quite important, I think, in that it hints at that need to build. And then lastly, the reversing of the value of material, kind of swapping the embodied energy of material and what is usually expected to be an artwork with very high embodied energy material, very precious, a treasure if you like, and switching that. But that the authorship perhaps then creates a higher value for what might be found anywhere within the city, but because you've extracted it and placed it in the gallery, it gives it a different value, and I think that's an interesting. And so, just to finish, just want to read this. It's a few notes that I've made on this handyman aesthetic, and this is really kind of underpinning, if you like, but not directly relating to this piece. The arrival of the handyman with no 5-year plans, short-term goals or hidden agendas. Art is a job, and he is here to do his job. Could be she. What is the function of this? Is it arbitrary? How does this serve me? The handyman may incite anger, dissatisfaction and ignorance. A one-way mirror reflection of the bourgeoisie flaneur, cloaked in the sterile space he has recently clocked out of. But to the intermittent tyro, a kindred spirit, there will open up a familiar intuition, a transparency and permeability, a hunch that these people are the same as them. Dionysian works. The handyman equips the renegade polymath, urban polymath, with his tools for living, recognizable significations, how to play a state system, not in the woods, but in the Alpha City. The handyman is the ultimate nearly man, a hardware dilettante who makes for the sake of making, but is under no obligation to finish what he started. He is the definitive failure of potential in the eyes of capitalism, but for the lucid few, the handyman points the way forward. A rough finish, inaccuracy, and the use of subordinate materials signal an alternative urban life, a necessity to build through the destruction of the module, and a continual existential search that begins deep inside the fabric of the city, in the legibility and the creation of unseen, uncharted spatial territory. So, there you go, that's me. Thanks.